Hi, all. Welcome to our psychedelics, changing our understanding of death and consciousness. So excited that we're we're back. We're gonna do this, and we will talk about psychedelics, but we'll also talk about altered states of being, other altered states of being, because certainly things like drumming or deep meditation can also help us understand our beliefs around death and consciousness. But I couldn't think of three better people to have this conversation with. They all bring a unique perspective to this, and so really excited about being able to share this conversation. This is a webinar, and so you will be able to put Q&A in questions in that Q&A button on the bottom. So please do as we go through this, because hopefully we can make this more engaging than a webinar usually is. I guess I also want to say, my beliefs around death and consciousness are actually formed as a layperson from a belief in quantum mechanics. I really believe that this physical body, anything physical, is just a vibration at a lower level. And so we live in a consciousness field, which again, as a layperson, I think will be found out to be by some physicist every bit of a legitimate field as electromagnetic field or the gravitational field, my personal opinion. So what I'd like to do before we jump into the questions and the conversation is to have everybody briefly introduce yourself. So if you could take 2 minutes, for each of you to say just a little bit about yourself, and then we'll jump in. So Norma, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Chris. I'm so happy to be here with everyone, especially on this topic. As a young person, I was fascinated with death and what does it mean. So I found out about Buddhism in my 20s and learned that young monks were encouraged to go to the charnel grounds. And wow, why was that young people would be moved toward looking at death? But I felt very drawn to do that, and I worked in a nursing home in my time right out of college, and that's like the charnel grounds in our society a lot of times where older people are just dumped there and not visited by their families or anything. So it was an immersion into seeing what our culture does in terms of denying the presence of death, not wanting to be close up to it, pushing it away, at the neglect of our elders a lot of times and the disrespect for their lives. And so I worked also in situations where people are suffering a lot, like in the battered women's movement and drug and alcohol center that I ran. And so I've been drawn to experience and be with people who are suffering, people who are dying, and then to get educated, both by Western means like going to graduate school for psychology and getting a master's of divinity, hospice chaplaincy training, as well as depth psychology, Jungian psychology, and studying with shamans and going to Japan to live in a Buddhist environment. So I've really sought the wisdom of the ages around what death is all about and then being with people in their experiences of it. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, thank you. And Norma holds a master's in divinity, and longtime chaplain and interfaith minister, ran Unity Church here in Ashland, Oregon, where we both live. So yeah, welcome. Dan, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Chris and Norma and Amy. It's a delight to be here in this conversation, really important conversation at this moment. Um, I was always fascinated by spirit, studied religion, all different religions in college. Um, was drawn back to my own spiritual tradition, Judaism, uh, through a connection to my mentor, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi. May his memory be a blessing. And decided to become a rabbi. Uh, and really spent 30 years as a congregational rabbi exploring. I always felt that end of life work was the most sacred work I was privileged to do, to be with people in that liminal space. Um, and I also was encouraged by my mentor to explore psychedelics as a means to engage a primary religious experience, and these passions about what end of life could teach us about how to live and how psychedelics enabled us to enter that space without fear, given the proper uh, safe set and setting, was a convergence that has deeply influenced my work at this stage of my life. I, along with my beloved, my wife Zoe Goldblatt, we formed a Jewish healing center here in the Bay Area and do a lot of end of life work and a lot of psychedelic education and integration work. And so continued my study of all different faith traditions and saw the commonalities, honored the differences, and am just really honored and delighted to be here.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Amy, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, my name is Amy Slonaker. I live in Santa Barbara, California, and I have a different perspective slightly on the topic since I am living with stage 4 metastatic breast and bone cancer. I was diagnosed in 2017 by my doctors at Memorial Sloan Kettering. They said I had 2 years to live, so I've quite extended my expiration date based on their estimate. And one of the things that has really helped me stay healthy, I feel, is engaging in psilocybin journeys. And the way that helps me kind of keep an even keel in the tumultuous waters of cancer. I can take a long view. It provides me like a horizon line for balance. And when my mind is able to be at ease in that way, then I feel like my body's in a safe place for healing. So for me, psilocybin is a part of what I think of as palliative care. I think most people think of palliative care as kind of an end of life thing, but it's also technically the definition includes those who are living with a chronic or terminal illness and what you can do to aid people as they navigate that disease while they're alive. So this psilocybin as palliative care was a big idea for me, and I helped co-found an organization called Survivorship Collective that raises funds for cancer survivors to receive state legal scholarships for state legal psychedelic therapy, and trying to bring the power of psychedelics to people living as cancer survivors.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to give a big shout out to Survivorship Collective. For anybody interested, I will include it in the email I send to everybody with the recording, but you can look up survivorshipcollective.org. So for any cancer survivor or thriver, right, Amy can check.
Absolutely. If you have interest in doing group psilocybin therapy in a state legal setting, we provide, don't let money be a barrier to that, because what we do is raise money to allow people to come experience that. If you have any interest in it or know a cancer survivor who might be interested, we'd love you to check out survivorshipcollective.org.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Amy, we'll stay on you because I think that's a really great, what you said is a really great segue into talking about, well, what is death? So whether or not your beliefs shifted, when you first were diagnosed to now, can you explain your beliefs around death and dying?
Definitely. I mean, when I was first diagnosed and told I had the 2 years to live, I was like smacked in the face with the reality of death and could only see it naturally as something very negative and a threat. And so that was my initial reaction to it. What I've come to see it as is a great teacher and a great motivator to get my life together, doing what it is I feel is important. Because without it, I would still be working been, without having received this diagnosis. I'm certain I would still be sitting at my desk as a lawyer on Wall Street, which is what I was doing. And this was I have to view it now as a blessing that, it tore me out of that environment where I was very miserable and forced me on a path of doing what fulfills me. So I went from seeing death as the worst nightmare imaginable to something that has transformed my life for the better. And that's 100% true.
Yeah, thank you. Norma, I know you have some wonderful stories about your beliefs around death and dying. So yeah, let's share it with everybody. You got to come off of mute.
Thank you. Yes, through my own lived experience of having a near death experience, I was shown that death is not an ending, that we do, our consciousness goes on after this body. So I believe that death is like a dropping of our mortal coil, as they say, and transitioning into our greater self that existed before we embodied and exists after. When you hear Buddhism talk about there is no self, the way I've come to interpret that is that we get attached to a certain idea of ourself, an image of who we are in this body, and we tend to cling to it. And that can be scary for people to lose what we identify with as this self, but it's the small self, and that there is a greater self. So, yes, from my experience, well, an image comes to mind that there, across traditions, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, there's this image of water, the river that flows into the ocean, the raindrop that returns to the cloud, the tide that withdraws only to rise again. These aren't merely poetic consolations, but they're pointing at something that contemplatives, shamans, and dying people have observed over and over again across the full span of human history, that consciousness, like water, doesn't simply stop. It just changes form.
That's beautiful. Can you share your near-death experience? Would you be okay with that?
Sure, if you want me to.
Yeah.
Uh, um, well, I had it because I was in a severe car accident, and my car was struck by another car going really fast. And when it first happened, I was catapulted out of my body and was looking down at the whole thing from above. But that wasn't the near death experience. It's just what happens in severe trauma. A lot of people talk about getting that perspective from looking down at the situation. When bystanders came rushing over to the car to ask me my name or identifying information, I couldn't speak. I couldn't say my name or anything, but then I say that Spirit gave me just a sentence to say, and that was call a surgeon. When the ambulance got there, they found that I had zero blood pressure, but I didn't have any outward signs of injury, but I had gotten a severed liver from the seatbelt. And so I kept saying, call a surgeon, call a surgeon. And so happily they listened to me, because if they wouldn't have, and the surgeon wasn't waiting right there at the emergency room door, I would be dead. So there in the emergency room, they sent me through a CAT scan and showed what was going on. So they wheeled me right into surgery. And I was able to speak somehow, even though I was in such extraordinary pain. But I said to the tall surgeon man rolling me into the operating room, "Do you think I'm going to live?" And he said, "I don't know, ma'am." He was being really honest with me. And I said, "Well, I have to live. I have a 5-year-old daughter, and I know I'm not meant to go yet. So whatever you do in the operating room, I want you to hold hands with all the people in there and pray for me that whatever you do will save my life." So many hours later, the surgery took many hours, and I was then in the med-surg recovery room, and this tall doctor came in to bend down and whisper to me. He said, "Ma'am, I'm not a religious man, but I did what you asked me to do," and we all held hands and prayed for you. And something came into the room, and we all felt it, and it brought tears to all of our eyes. So I think you're going to live. So that was wonderful. And then, though I was in ICU, and I had ventilator, 9 different tubes, pumps in my arms and legs, and it was the 3rd day into it, and my body was not making it. They had called my mother and father to be there present, and they stayed overnight in the room because the medical people had told them that I might die that night. So I did, and came back, obviously, but in the night, I left my body, and I looked back at it, saw it lying there, and went on. And as you've heard others describe, a tunnel of light opened up, and I was hurtling through that tunnel for a time, and then came through to an amazing place that was full of not only light, but extraordinary love beyond anything we can describe. It's so full, so tangible. And then I was met immediately by these 4 beings. And as soon as I saw them, I recognized them like my oldest, dearest friends from ages past and ages future. And each one of them was distinct and, yes, had a face and a beingness, a personality, and I knew them. And it was so comforting to see them, like reuniting, And they talked to me, and I could ask many questions about the meaning of life, and being there in their presence was so inviting, so overwhelmingly beautiful, and like love we've never felt here below. So you don't want to leave. But after a time, they said to me, "You can stay if you want to. We understand how people don't want to leave once they come here, but we prefer that you go back." So they gave me a choice, and then I began to remember my life back here and my child and everything. So I did choose to come back, and they came with me, which is quite unusual, I think, back through the tunnel and into the hospital room. And I was standing there then with them, looking at my parents who were leaned together, sleeping there. We walked over to them, and they said to me, "See how much you know your parents in this lifetime, and how much better you know us than even your own parents." So they were just emphasizing to me this deep, long connection with them. And then they walked me over to the bed where my body was lying, and they said, "Are you ready to go back in?" And so then, whoom, went back in. And then my perception was coming out of my bodily eyes toward these 2 beings when they stood each on each side of the bed. And they stayed with me for I don't know how long, but allowing me to ask more questions about what my purpose would be and why I was coming back, and remnant questions that I had about my life, like, why couldn't I do this? Why couldn't I do that? I said, "No, that's not in the plan." So, it was like being told the truth too, And they had me compare touching them and touching the bed, and feeling the difference between that reality and this reality, and how ecstatically alive that reality is, even more so than this reality. They kept saying, "See how real the reality of the other dimension is compared to what we say is real and tangible here." And they also emphasized that I was to tell others that beings like them exist for everyone, and that we're never alone, and we're not alone at death. So I was already being a hospice chaplain then, and that whole experience, of course, gave me a tremendous hope and Gnostic or lived experience to tell others who were dying and to comfort them and to comfort their families that they wouldn't be alone, that we are met by these loving beings and we're going somewhere that is beyond our imagination, so full of love and so interbeing and comforting. So that's my experience.
Well, you know what you remind me of? That was beautiful. Thank you for sharing. When I think of consciousness, I think of a spirit world or again, something not tangible. And yet what you were describing is a tangible set of beings who then have an ability to move into spirit or whatever. Yeah, I don't think many people think of it that way. That was great. All right, Dan, top that story. Um,
No, no, not possible. Um, I would just say that from a very early age, I had experiences that I couldn't put words to. Today, I might say they were out of body experiences, mystical experiences that drew me to the awareness that there is a world beyond the material world. So I've lived with that awareness my whole life, having had, like Norma, the privilege of being with I don't know how many 60, 70, 100 people who have died, being with them as they transitioned. It was quite clear to me and everyone who was there that um, something something happened. It's difficult again to put words to it, but there was something in the room when the person drew their last breath, and an awareness that death is really about challenges us to reconfigure our relationship with someone who has left their body. It's not what our culture teaches us to do, uh, but some of our traditions give us insights into how to do this work to reformat an experience with someone who is no longer embodied. And that's something having experienced the death of my of some people very close to me, including my late wife. Um, I'm very aware of the reality of an ongoing consciousness that is a part of my life that transcends death. Many of our traditions say that, teach us that people die, but love doesn't, connection doesn't die, can't die. And so this is a reality that I've lived with and practiced and taught most of my adult life.
yeah, thank you. Well, I'd like you to speak a little bit about, the fact that, I know your faith is rooted in Jewish mysticism. I mean, you were also the former leader of Aleph, the Jewish Renewal Center. So, can you speak how that faith, Jewish mysticism, has also informed your beliefs around death and dying?
Sure. And I would say it's not just the Jewish mystical tradition. It's pretty mainstream that there is something that's called the world to come, and it's certainly a mystery. It's shrouded in mystery, but there is a deep held belief that there is something about us that cannot die. We can call it soul, we can call it life force. It doesn't really matter, but there is something that transitions from this vehicle that has carried us through our lives when our body expires, dies. And you know, we don't know what that mystery is, but it's very clearly taught in Jewish mainstream and certainly in the Jewish mystical tradition that there is a consciousness, a soul force that um, transcends death and continues to impact if we are open to it, if we are maintain an awareness that we can stay connected to those souls who are no longer alive, no longer embodied.
Yeah. You said a key phrase there, open to it. So many of us shut that stream or source, whatever you want to call it, off. Yeah, that's
Well, I
great.
think it's a cutting off when we shut down, when we close our consciousness to that possibility, that dimension of reality, then it's we're no longer connected to it in a way we're aware of. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means we're not tuned into it. We can choose to tune in or not tune in. Um, and those of us who are more tuned in, it has an impact on how we live, profound impact.
Yeah, beautiful. All right, let's switch to how psychedelics did change, maybe beliefs around death and dying. So, Amy, let's go back to you and can you share some of the lessons learned from your psilocybin journeys?
Yeah, and they're remarkably in parallel with some of the things that Dan and Norma talked about as what they'd learned, well, as what Norma learned about in her near-death experience and what Dan has come to understand through his spiritual journey. And that is that there is continuity of consciousness from this material plane to whatever comes after it. Um, and that's come to me through psilocybin and other ways, being inside of a psychedelic experience where it's as if the material world is just lifted up like a theater curtain, and you see underneath more real than real. I think Norma used that expression, that was a more real realm that she'd visited. And that is a sense that I've also gotten, that there's something more real beyond this. And it's kind of hard to explain, but it gives me a sense of calm that I don't need to cling so desperately to this ego that I've developed, that's not going to be the end of the world or the end of consciousness when I shuffle off this mortal coil. And that, again, I said it a little bit before, it just provides the kind of mental peace that allows my body to sit in a restful healing state, and it helps me fight the metastatic cancer that's still inside of me. And that's how I feel about it. That through the revelations of psilocybin, my mind is less anxious and my body's better able to heal.
You talked before too about how psilocybin taught you about suffering. Can you speak to that?
Yes, definitely. I think the you can see the process of physical death as analogous to a process of death and rebirth that maybe we might read about oftentimes in mythology. I study mythology, and I got my PhD in that from Pacifica Graduate Institute recently. And so when I think about death and rebirth, and I see it written about in myth, I see it as an analogy for a kind of transformation through suffering, if you will. The process of death, of course, is a physical suffering and a mental suffering. The journeys that people like Jonah and the whale took were like a journey into the depths and up to rebirth. And I think that Um, Sorry, I'm just losing my train of thought because I was getting too much into examples. But basically that this is like a transformation that's happening in this underground passage, and that in it we're learning to suffer, and from that suffering we can learn something important. So, like in myths, when Jonah comes out and has kind of a renewed relationship with God, I can see my suffering through this journey with cancer as basically being something that's going to teach me something. Is something positive is going to come out of this. And when I take psychedelics and I'm in a state of physical or mental suffering just from what that journey is like, afterwards I can look back and see, you know what, that suffering was valuable because I've come to certain conclusions. I've learned certain things in that. And then I can say, my own physical death is going to be a process of transformation, and I'm going to be able to learn and grow from that too. Not just in this life, making myself a better person now, but, I can understand that as a transformation that's going to lead to growth and something positive. So that's kind of a roundabout way to talk about suffering as positive, but psilocybin lets me practice suffering for the big suffering and the most important one of all that will transform us.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad you shared that. Norma, I know with your work on Journey to Completion, which I would love you to speak about as well, to key off what Amy was just talking about. But I also want you to share, how psychedelics have, well, you already had shifted your beliefs and understanding of what death and dying are, but also to talk about the psychedelic experience and how that really informed some of your current beliefs.
Thank you, Chris. I've been very involved in the psychedelic renaissance. Been a teacher and many experiences with people, but long before those experiences, I was brought to this threshold of exploration about death through sacred ceremony with the Huichol and other indigenous elders. And they're guardians of an unbroken lineage of visionary knowledge. So I was shown truths that no amount of reading could have prepared me for. These weren't beliefs adopted intellectually, but realities that I encountered directly in the body and the heart. The Huichol talk about finding the path of heart, the path with heart, and then dedicating yourself to walking that. So, in dimensions of awareness that stretch far beyond what ordinary waking life allows us to perceive, I ventured into these realms of heart. And like Amy's saying, I think the first and perhaps most liberating of these truths was this, that our wounds are not accidents and they're not punishments. They're precisely calibrated gifts. What I was shown and what researchers like Dr. Stan Groff and Dr. Roland Griffiths have since explored through the lens of psychedelic assisted therapy is that the experiences that we most dread, the wounds we most wish to escape, carry within them the very medicine that we most need, right? Our trauma is our destiny path. It's been shaped by forces larger than our individual lives, often weaving through the threads of family lineages, right, that stretch back generations. So the healing that we're called to do, I often say, is not only our own, but it is ancestral. That we have to walk toward our wounds with courage because that's our destiny path in this lifetime. But we are accompanied by wise guides, and we're here to transmute not just our own suffering, but the suffering of those who came before us and of those who will come after. So death cannot separate us from love is one of the most profound teachings that I've gotten from these psychedelics experiences. Love is not extinguished at the threshold of death. It just grows larger, more luminous, more complete. And so what about death itself, though? What I came to know firsthand with certainty that has never left me, like you heard me say, is that the universe is not composed of dead matter. Everything is alive. And I think that's what others of you who have experienced indigenous teachings have come to experience too. The rocks, the trees, the rivers, the birds, the wind moving through the tall grass, all of it is conscious. All of it is interbeing. within the vast creative intelligence that indigenous peoples' lives have always called the creator, the great mystery, the living web. It's not a metaphor, it is experience. And when the boundaries of our separate self are dissolved in a psychedelic experience, what remains is not emptiness, but a radical belonging, a recognition that I had never been or could never be truly alone or truly separate. So, you know, I always like to honor my lineage, and I got to study with Dr. Stan Groff in transpersonal psychology and have worked with a lot of the people who have gone through the Johns Hopkins psilocybin studies, and they all consistently describe the same encounter, this profound disillusion of the boundary between ourself and the world that's replaced by a felt sense of a true unity with all things. So if everything's woven together this way, if consciousness is not our private possession, but the very medium in which all life breathes, then death cannot sever us from this love that constitutes our deepest nature. Love is it's not a feeling that lives inside a body and ends when the body ends. It's the underlying fabric. And psychedelics has helped me to encounter that. And this doesn't diminish at death, it just expands. So these journeys, they've revealed to me capacities of consciousness that our ordinary frameworks give us no room to hold. I learned that awareness can travel into other times, other dimensions, other locations in the cosmos. Maybe some of you have had those kind of experiences too. I learned that the inner lives of others can be felt with a vividness that exceeds ordinary perception. I've actually been able to feel into the experiences of others so vividly. This is documented. You know, researchers studying psilocybin and ayahuasca and related medicines have recorded reports of what can only be called telepathic or precognitive experience. Anomalous to knowing that challenges are strictly materialistic kind of interpretations of our mind. The indigenous elders who guided me required no explanation of this. They just accepted so much that we are not alone, that we've never been alone, that we're in a great community of helpers. And so I think this is, I'll just end on this, that perhaps that's the most quietly revolutionary teaching and the simplest of all through the psychedelics, to just keep emphasizing we are not alone. None of us are. And so what ceremony revealed was the surrounding presence of wise helpers. So in my journey to completion work, it's a deep training program, and what Amy was talking about that going down into the underworld, encountering our wounds, our shadow elements, getting the gift out of them, and returning a changed person. In these deep journeys down in and back up out, we encounter the helpers. We encounter our animal guides. We encounter ancestors, many beings who are watching us, who are helping us. It's amazing that we humans have these helpers. We need these helpers. We have each other, but we have these other dimensional beings too. So we're never meant to navigate the depths alone. We're to be accompanied, and that is real. So taken all together, what I'm saying, I think these experiences transformed me, not simply in a way about my beliefs about death, but my experiential encounter with it. So if love cannot be extinguished, if consciousness pervades all things, like I'm saying, if our wounds are gifts in disguise and our guides are never far, then death's not an ending to be feared at all, but a passage into a deeper, very real reality that's always been holding us. We don't fall into an oblivion. We fall into a greater belonging.
Beautiful. And your work in Journey to Completion is basically helping individuals go into the shadow and hopefully then transform. Um, but you do that without psychedelics.
Right, right. I've I've worked with psychedelics since my youth through indigenous training, but I wanted to show people that there is a way within our own consciousness to go into these altered states, and that's what ancient cultures have taught young people and trained them before they were adults in being able to use drumming journeys and lucid dreaming to go into these lucid states without the assistance of any substances. Although it's fantastic that we humans are given the entheogens, we're so blessed that way, but that we have capacities within our own being to go into these altered states. So my daughter is a very advanced lucid dreamer, and we've written a couple of books together. One is Lucid Dreaming, Lucid Living, which is a manual to teach you how to enter into lucid dreaming, and then Navigating Liminal Realms, which is a training in how the drumming journey and the dreaming states relate to one another, and then how they can lead into a better experience of psychedelics because you learn your internal psychonavigation skills because we each have our own map of consciousness that we have to learn. So that book is my effort in getting people to realize that there are these non-drug induced states we should enter. And then my next book will be coming out soon, which is my whole manual on the journey to completion training. So you can look at our website at luciddreaminglucidliving.com to find all of this and our online courses too.
Thank you. Dan, were you going to add something earlier?
Well, it's just, it seems to me that um, so many of us live the first part of our lives with the illusion that we're immortal, with no awareness. And then so often when people around us start to die, there's people often live in this desperation mode of, bucket lists and getting everything in and I think they're both illusions. If we pay attention to, many of us having attended so many births and so many deaths, it feels like it's the same experience, just at the other end of the spectrum. The coming into this life is an intense, powerful, beautiful experience. And there's pain and there's challenge, and it's messy. And often death is the same way, and I think that um, the gift of psychedelics, and again, it's one tool. It's not necessary. It's not for everyone. It can be this awareness, this expansive consciousness can be achieved other ways, but psychedelics can allow one to experience timeless time. And when we escape mm, the sense that time is oppressive, when we live fully in the moment, in my tradition, um, one of the powerful names for the divine is um, I will be whom I will be. That is to say, the divine is the power of becoming, and we are always becoming, and death is a becoming. And so that the divine is the power of healing and transformation in the universe. Um, the most sacred name for the divine in my tradition is a kind of a mashup of the past, present, and future into a four-letter word that simply means that there is only one moment, the moment we are in. And what psychedelics can afford one an experience of the illusory nature of time. And if we can fully inhabit timeless time, we live differently and we die differently. And that is the gift, one of the great gifts, aside from the exploration as both Norma and Amy talked about when the ego dissolves and we get over ourselves and can um, encounter a deeper awareness and the truths and the shadow and the wounds. We have the ability to heal our lineage and to heal what's coming forward out through generations to come with the awareness and the healing that we bring into the world. Dialoguing with the ancestors is not a metaphor. We can connect to them just as we can connect to our unborn children and share our truths and our insights with them as a part of healing epigenetic trauma that, as Norma said, are some of our greatest teachers. So this awareness that one can access in an expanded state of consciousness can illuminate our lives and our deaths in a powerful way. I've in a journey, I experienced my own death, and it was breathtakingly beautiful. And I was held and I was loved, and people often ask me, as whether I'm functioning, uh, if I go into the hospital and I'm invited or asked to visit people of any faith or no faith, people who are nearing the end of their lives, to be able to hold space for them, honor the sacredness of this, and I think, if we can dissolve some of the fear that we're no longer going to be. I've never met anyone who worried about all the generations where they weren't alive until they came into life. No one worries about that. But, people go, wow, I'm going to be gone. I'm going to be done. I'm going to be nothing. And if we can let go of that fear, we can experience, we can experience our deaths in the full sacred dimension that is afforded us. And you know, I, I feel like, you know, we, we, we can teach people how to die differently than so many of us were taught. Um, that this is something terrible and horrible and to be deeply feared. Um, and I think that you know there is a responsibility to enable people to both approach their deaths and experience their deaths in a very different way. Um, uh, and I think when we gather families and friends around people who are, in their dying process, and we hold them and we love them out, our own fear of death diminishes. We don't have to be terrified by it. Um, and I think that there is, psychedelics can be a tool to do this powerful work that is the work of all work, um, and it's a beautiful thing. And I think that um, you know psychedelics can um, bring us into an awareness that we don't have to understand everything that's going to happen to us, where we're going to go, what's going to be. That's part of the mystery. But to embrace that mystery, to love that mystery is a beautiful, it's something that we don't spend much time doing in this culture. And so many of our ancient traditions have teachings about this. And it's a blessing to be tuning into them at this moment of human history. Uh, uh, I think that um, when we when we gather, when we tell our stories about um, how we love, how we can live in love and die in love, um, then the fear, the fear dissipates, and and we live differently and die differently.
Yeah, you remind me when we conducted this psychedelic death workers study, one of my favorite stories was about a client who had said psilocybin helped them go into the fear of the unknown, and it was okay. I think as humans, that's one of our biggest issues. It kind of goes, it's a corollary to you have to be open to it. It's we have a fear of letting go. And so it was like, yeah, it's okay that it's the unknown. I'm ready. I'm ready for it. You had shared a story about a client specifically who was terrified of dying, and you helped her. Do you want to share that story?
Sure. This is a woman who lived into her 90s and was her, had a terrible experience where she was shielded from death, which means death gained this terror within her, and she didn't want to talk about death. She couldn't attend funerals. She couldn't hear about it. It was just triggered her in such a profound way. And and as she was clearly moving towards the end of her life, um, you know, I we talked about did she want, that she could have an experience, and this was a ketamine experience, which would give her a sense of what it would be like to be disembodied, to be a consciousness floating in the cosmos. And I said to her, I'm going to be with you the whole time. And if you experience fear, all you have to do is squeeze my hand. I will hold your hand the whole time. You can squeeze my hand and you know you're on a journey and you're not yet in the death experience. And she came through the experience and it's only an hour and a half, and she came out and through the experience and she looked at me and she said, I get it. And, everyone who came into her room in her last 3 days of her life, her daughters, who were all in their late 60s, two daughters who were in their older, and came into the hospital room and said, and they were stunned because something in her had profoundly relaxed. It was the most beautiful psychic and spiritual pirouette I've ever seen. And she said, I've lived a beautiful life and I'm ready. I'm ready to move on. And it was glorious. And I just want to say that, you know, death itself is a psychedelic experience, and scientists are learning more and more about how, one of the most powerful psychedelic molecules, DMT, is in the brain, and they're monitoring how DMT is released at the time of death. And so I don't think that psychedelic experiences are best offered near death. You don't need it. When one gets a terminal diagnosis or one hears news, the earlier the better to have had some psychedelic experiences so one can deal with the fear and one can deal with the shadow as they approach their end of life experience. And then they can let the wondrous awe-filled experience of death be what it needs to be. Um, you know, whenever we go through an enormously powerful transition in our lives, we, um, we often tune into the fear aspect of it. And fear is a part of awe, but it's a small part of awe. It is not the whole of awe. If we can learn to find, let fear be where it is, see it for what it is, and experience the awe of all of our life transitions, then our lives are filled with wonder. And death is one of those wonderful, wonder-filled experiences if we allow it to be, if we don't cloud it out with fear and terror.
I'm so glad you brought up the ketamine story because I was thinking we've talked mostly I think about psilocybin here, and then you brought up DMT, but um, uh, I'm curious to know your thoughts on are there different psychedelic medicines that lend themselves more to the feeling of death or what exists on the other side? I mean, I am reminded of a lovely story by Jahan. And Jahan, at the time that she shared her story, had metastasized cancer to the bone and it was considered end stage. And she was a psychonaut, definitely. But at that point in time, she was undergoing ketamine therapy twice a week. Could have been in part for the pain, but her intention became, I am going to go to the other side and chit chat. And that is what she did. She'd go over to the other side and chit chat with whomever and come back. And I just thought that that was a lovely story. We know that from a retrospective study that ketamine is most like a death experience. We call it a dress rehearsal for death, basically. And you hit the nail on the head, Dan, when you said, as a dissociative anesthetic, your mind becomes separate from your body. Um, you realize you can exist without your body. I remember at one point when I was on a ketamine journey, I thought, oh, Dr. Reichbach, you have to tell my son I'm not coming back. And it's like, yeah, but I'm laughing, going, well, I'm thinking this. I think I will come back, and I did. But it's a very interesting and different experience sometimes from say psilocybin, which tends to be more somatic. But from all of your experience, can you speak to any of the other molecules that also or yeah took you into these death realms?
I
Yeah,
think,
Norma, or go ahead.
no, go ahead, Norma.
Oh, well, you can too comment on it, Dan, but I was thinking about my experience with the Huichol who work with peyote and mescaline in that peyote form held in that incredibly sacred container by the ancient practices and teachings of not being afraid of death. Uh, the the peyote really does take you into an experience of death in your body. And in one of my experiences with the Huichol, I was digging my grave in the dirt, and I, with my hands, just digging, 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 because I really felt like I was going to die. And I did, in some sense, encounter death. And then Guadalupe de los Rios was our wonderful guide. And at a certain point, she came over to me when it was the right moment in the experience. And she said, "Get up, stand up. It's not your time to die." And I was then infused with some powerful energy that raised me up. So it was like a resurrection. I literally rose up on my feet and started shaking all over, dancing and shaking, filled with a new life energy. And then I went into this incredibly ecstatic state of, I call it the beatific vision or the vision of unity. And I just felt such union with everything around me. So that can happen with other medicines too, but I must say that the peyote was the strongest experience that I ever had of that death and complete rebirth.
Mm.
But I think it has to do with the way it's held too, the sacred ceremony, the safe container, the ancient wisdom, like Dan's
That's
talking about too, that you're you're surrounded by that helps that to happen safely. I'll just say one more thing too, that Thich Nhat Hanh, who I had the privilege of being with for many years in the 80s and 90s, was always saying, no death, no fear. And so, to be able to be held in a way that teaches you what that means, because it's so important to realize that fear on planet Earth is just something that's used to keep us small, and it keeps us separate from one another, from our power, and from the divine, like Dan's talking about. And our culture's been so conditioned to treat death as this ultimate threat that makes people easier to control, right? But when we're in these altered states and these psychedelic experiences, we access these realms of extraordinary love and power. So, like the Course in Miracles says, really it all kind of boils down to one decision that we keep being offered. Is it going to be fear or love that we choose? And as we choose love in these expanded states, we're set free. So that freedom is what the psychedelics are helping people to experience. And that is such a valuable thing, because then we come back into our ordinary consciousness with that freedom and with the ability to be more present in the moment. Like, I'll just end with this, but I was out on a walk this morning and I was looking at the incredible beauty of the cherry blossom trees right now. And I was remembering being in Japan, and when the cherry blossoms are blooming just for one short week, the whole culture shuts down. So talk about a psychedelic unified experience. Nobody goes to work. Everybody goes out and sits under the cherry blossom trees and has a picnic for several days. The whole culture just enjoys the beauty, extreme beauty and impermanence of the cherry blossoms. And so for a whole culture to practice impermanence like that makes it in a lot of ways more gentle and attuned to the exquisite beauty of our lives. And I think that's what we're talking about here. When we don't fear death anymore, then we can be attuned to this exquisite beauty of life, birth, life, and death, that we're experiencing something divinely, extraordinarily beautiful.
And I think that, thank you, Norma. Mm, you know, like you said, Chris, ketamine is a dissociative drug. So it's you know, we did several cohorts with for people who were going to be um, end of life workers, whether they were hospice workers, end of life doulas, therapists, physicians, nurses, um, that we did cohorts of ketamine experience, but the critical thing was we had them prepare. They wrote their own eulogies. We did exercises and spiritual practices, meditative practices to prepare them. And the preparation is so, set and setting is so important in terms of what we can experience. I mean, under utilizing any medicine, certainly a medicine, sacred medicine like 5-MeO DMT is a they DMT is often called the God molecule because we have these experiences that are so extraordinary and so beyond our normal existence. So there's some medicines that have that ability, but I think uh, any whether it's ayahuasca or mescaline or peyote, LSD, I think all of the hallucinogenics, even um, even there's some medicines that aren't sort of categorized as hallucinogenics, but can open our hearts and expand our consciousness in a way that we can open to things beyond our normal consciousness, and death is among them. So, to me, it's the set and setting, the preparation as important, if not more important than the particular medicine. And the most important aspect is the integration. What you do with what is what comes, into this, into your awareness in this expanded state. So I know so many people that, just use these medicines as recreationally, and I have no judgment about that. But for me, um, I would not do that just because I have so much respect for the opportunity, the privilege of what it means to be in a state of expanded consciousness. I always want to feel safe, and I want to be prepared, and I want to have people who can enable me to do the important integration work. Because if you use it recreationally, it's an experience, an experience. And how does that impact the way you live? How does that impact your your soul journey, your trauma, your shadow? Only with the proper preparations, the proper safety during the journey, and the integration from my perspective, does this work become life changing and enlivening and really worth it in the deepest, most meaningful way.
Yeah, well said, well said. Integration, in the pilot program that we're doing, home-based ketamine and spiritual care, we are calling it meaning making now instead of integration, seems more applicable. And by the way, this is a great pilot, so stay tuned for more information. We are pairing a palliative care physician with either an end-of-life doula or a chaplain or a minister, actually, and going into the home. I want to be mindful of allowing uh, for people to ask questions. And perhaps as they think about questions, they can drop in the Q&A there on the bottom. We've sort of touched on this, but I'm also reminded of the proximity of death and life. There's a gentleman that I also had the good fortune, Amy, you were on this panel discussion with Jason. And Jason is a gentleman who's been living with quadriplegia now for probably 32 years. But after about 31 years, he had gotten to a point where he did not want to live. The pain had just become excruciating, and he was contemplating death. But he decided to participate in a psilocybin journey through the Sanctuary Church, and that's PS Sanctuary. They have a sacred passages program. And as after he did that, and he's participated in several psilocybin journeys, he came to understand that he lives in a bubble. And this is in part due to the severing of his cervical spine. And I'm not a medical person, so if I didn't say that right, sorry. But, he exists in this sort of bubble between life and death. And he'll say that he kind of shifts into death and then life. And during the conversation, Amy, right, he stopped because he said, "You're going to have to come back to me." And he said, but as a result, he lives life. He lives life with love for everybody. And I want to take a short segue here. We've got so many lovely people on this webinar, but I've asked David Dansky, and I think I've just made you, yes, a panelist, David, so you should be able to come on. So David is an ER doc, and he has told these great stories about patients. He has seen a lot, I guess, unfortunately, of people pass. But you have a couple of really great stories of where, again, you're like those people are alive after they've died, if
Mhm,
I could put it that way.
mhm. Um, so I think the first time it hit me was when a little old lady came in a little white nightgown, having been found dead in her bed in a nursing home at about 3 o'clock in the morning. And by the time she gets to us, it's, 4 or 5 in the morning, and we're all a little blurry-eyed, but running a code blue is something we've all done a million times. And there's me and a couple of nurses and a tech. And the paramedics did a great job of trying to revive her. She really didn't respond. We're throwing a few extra things at her that the paramedics don't have. And all of a sudden, I feel this heavy cloak over my shoulders, like a Victorian mantle, to keep out the London cold in the 1850s or something. I mean, I could really feel it, like something pressing on my shoulders. And it was suffused with this old wizened joy. I was in my 30s. Maybe I could feel wizened joy right now, but back then I was in my 30s, not that old. And but it was a feeling I'd never had before. I've never had since. And I was sort of discombobulated for a moment because I didn't know what this feeling was. And after a few seconds, I realized the only thing that makes sense is that this is her coming out and just on her way out, as though to say, thank you, namaste, whatever. And I looked at all my confreres and I said, I don't think we're getting this one back, guys. And one of my techs had its fingers on her femoral pulse. And all of a sudden, after 30 or 40 seconds, that feeling of that cloak just disappeared. And 10 seconds later, the tech said, hey, I've got a pulse back. And I was shocked. And, we resuscitated her. She never woke up. She went to the ICU. She never died the next day. I was never able to check in with her to see what that experience was. But at least it taught me, like, sort of a wake-up call, pay more attention. And that was 30, 35 years ago. And since that time, I've paid a lot more attention to what actually happens as people die. And it can be kind of funny. It can be like, hey, well, this is kind of nice, like your first really good scotch. Or it can be hilarious, and it can be just wildly ecstatic, like, oh my God, I had no idea how magnificent this could be. And I mean, just beyond, it's a little bit like what Dan was alluding to, where it's just beyond anything imaginable on this planet, and in our material world. And most recently, in the ER, a fellow came in because he thought he was having an allergic reaction. And actually, he was going into cardiopulmonary failure. I mean, basically, his lungs were shutting down, his heart was shutting down. And I told him after an hour or two, look, there's not that much there's nothing I can do for you that wouldn't kill you medically. I can try to paralyze you and put you down to hook you up to a breathing machine, but just those drugs themselves would kill you. And we are going to make this so comfortable. And he looked at me and said, you mean this is it? I'm dying right here on this gurney. I said, don't worry, we'll make this good. And over the next hour, we just fed him enough medications. It wasn't, I would have loved to have used ketamine, but that would have been a stress on his heart, unfortunately. But we used morphine and Ativan and things like that. And he had a very peaceful death. He eventually went flatline. And about after a while, we said our prayers there. And I went back to my workstation. And after a couple minutes, I suddenly felt this incredibly warm embrace come from behind, as though, just it was him, it was his energy. But he was a pretty quirky guy, and all the quirks were gone. It was just the pure spirit of him. I don't know how else to describe it. I mean, these are very subjective things. And lastly, I had a friend who I'd been helping through prostate cancer, and his oncologist had given him to maybe the end of the year. So right on target, 10 p.m., New Year's Eve, we get a frantic call from his wife. I think he's in pain. I think he's suffering. He's thrashing about. And so my wife and I, they live close by. My wife and I go running over to their home. And it's what we call Kussmaul breathing, where parts of the body are shutting down, not getting enough. You're going into anaerobic metabolism and the body's trying to compensate. So he's not noticing it, but it was disturbing for his wife. And I remembered that we kept a little stash of drugs in her refrigerator for this and just, an eventuality like this. And I pulled out a quadruple dose of Ativan, which is like Valium or Versed, and plunged it into his thigh. And over the next 15 minutes, he calmed down, he settled down. We left him to pass with his wife, knowing that it would be sometime in the next few hours or maybe a day. And as I got home and I was just putting some of my equipment away in my office, and there he was, this friend of mine who was such a beautiful man, but had never had a spiritual experience in his life and always wanted one. And he was standing there, all 6'5" of him, grinning at me, saying, "Why are you plunging syringes into corpses when everything is so beautiful? Everything is so perfect. Everything is love." And his eyes flashed one more time and he vanished. And it was the most, it was the most beautifully humbling message. So those are a few of the experiences that I've had, trying to deal with the medical aspects of death and still being truly touched by the benevolence and artistry of spirit and just the humility of the whole experience of living and dying.
Mm,
So
thank, th- thank you. Thank you. Stay there. We have two questions in the chat, and you might be able to help with the second one. But Amy Karen has asked, she'd love to hear more about your journey. For instance, how does your positive attitude around terminal diagnosis affect your family, friends, and even other people with cancer that she knows?
Oh, thank you so much for that question. I'm glad to see that my positive attitude comes across. What I like to I'm happy to talk about my experience with anyone that wants to hear about it because I think that so much of cancer is fear-based and people are just terrified and they will not, and this will keep them even from seeking treatment or a diagnosis. And if we can't just speak openly about our experience and show that there can be positive aspects to it, we keep people in the dark and in fear. So that is how I hope my sharing my story and the positives and negatives helps others. My family, to be honest, they have a very difficult time accepting my illness, and my positive attitude helps them think that there's nothing wrong. So, it doesn't always have the desired impact. It makes it easier on them, but they are kind of, I gotta say, they're kind of in denial, and that's how they can deal with it. It's very upsetting, situation to be dealing with a daughter or sister that, has this. But yeah, my journey was like really turned around, because I was brought up a fundamentalist Christian and I had to reject that way of thinking. And so for a while I thought I can't do spirituality. Spirituality is something I can't respect or be a part of. But thanks to my cancer journey and the work I've done with psychedelics, I've been able to re-embrace my own spirituality in a way that works for me. And that's a big part of my journey is the ability to re-embrace contact and engagement with the spiritual world without standard religion, institutionalized religion.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Amy,
And
and
I'm
thanks
happy
for
and contact me via Survivorship Collective if you have really more questions about my journey because it's been long and varied and I'm always happy to talk about it. So please find me through Survivorship Collective and I'll chat all day about it.
It's great. Um, Russell asks a really great question and one we normally get. Are there possibilities to work with people who choose medical aid in dying in states where legal? Or is it too late by that time? David, you work with medical aid in dying patients, right?
we're the last step before. Yeah, I mean, as a ketamine, I'm a ketamine practitioner, and so they come to us for some type of, spiritual and also pain management to see if we can keep them from having to take that route. My youngest patient is 33. It's
Mm.
fright. Yeah, yeah. And so, I mean, I think it's a tremendous time because, we forget it's not just the illness and the disability and the weakness, but it's also, I mean, to be blunt, it's feeling gaslit by the medical community. Doctors hate taking care of patients that we can't help, and we'd much rather blame our patients for it than blame ourselves. We're so sorry you didn't respond to the treatment. We're so sorry that this medication didn't work for you. The implication, of course, is it works for everybody else. It's clearly not the medic. So there are these subtle hints, and after a while, it's like death by a thousand paper cuts. And I find myself texting a lot with patients who are getting miserable care in tertiary care hospitals, who should be the state of the art, but they're being treated by humans. And if you've seen any episodes of The Pit, which is on HBO Max, and I just bring that up because they're technical geniuses and they have the emotional development of a 4 or 5 year old, which is where so many of us get off, of course, get off the chain. And it is really striking how we can have so much and sometimes do so little with it. I think E.O. Wilson once said that the trouble with humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And that's where we're stuck. We have a Paleolithic emotion about someone, boom, it goes viral. And the medieval institutions may prosecute it over the years to come very, very slowly. It's that sort of thing. And it's still really true. So much of what we have to offer each other is just sheer compassion, which is what I see so beautifully witnessed in all the speakers here today. It's really amazingly heart touching. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Anybody else work with patients who, Norma? Oh yeah, of course you did. Nor, do you want to share a story?
Hmm. Well, I'm just thinking as David was speaking that in Buddhism, there are two primary vows. I vow to seek understanding, and I vow to have compassion. So to take on these type of vows in life then really help us to live a better life, and that also it's about growing to be more and more detached. And I came up with the combination of passionate detachment, like
Mm.
we're still passionate and caring about everything, and yet detachment is the key to our lives, really, right? In all wisdom traditions, we have to learn to detach from our failures and from our successes, from our ideas of what we were supposed to do and what we failed to do, and from what we gained and what we lost, and in short, from our ego, right? So I just experienced an incredible death process with a longtime friend and a real prominent leader on the West Coast in sex therapy. So she was a wonderful teacher of love and what it's all about in our human expression. And she was dying in her 60s, relatively young, and she really exhibited to everyone around her this passion for life, extreme passion for life and love and our bodies and everything, and her land that she lived on and brought her children and grandchildren to, and so really connected to the earth and land and her body, and yet an incredibly beautiful detachment to this life and a willingness to let go and to involve the whole community. So, literally, hundreds of people came through her land and her house in the last week to experience the presence of her and someone like this who was so beautifully showing a life well lived, and an ability to be calm and present in the presence of death. And so I was honored to lead the ritual of her funeral ceremony, and what a tremendous experience of wailing, crying, deep emotions, and dancing ancient Celtic dances and celebrating extremely her life and what life is. So I wish that for everyone that you would get to experience that type of passage. I'm not saying that psychedelics was involved, but she had been a person that I'd done many psychedelic journeys with. And so as we practice, right, this letting go of our ego and going into the realms of death and back over and over again in our lives, it gives us this ability to approach our real death with an incredible honoring of it and then transmitting that to everyone around us. So it was just an incredible experience for our whole community to get to be with somebody dying that way. I've heard that in Bali, the deaths are often like that, that the people have those shamanic experiences in the Buddhist foundation of this impermanence of life, so that the funerals are often huge celebrations of marching down the streets, singing and with tambourines and joyful experiences. So yes, as we, you know, practice through psychedelics and altered states, are going back and forth, in and out of form. Hopefully, we can get to that place of that kind of not just calmness, but ecstatic joy in approaching death.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that great story. Russell, I don't know if that answered your question. I will say generally, I believe, and any of you can rebut this, but that we don't recommend psychedelic journey right before you take the medical aid and dying medicines. So it's something I love what Norma shared, that it's something that you use as a dress rehearsal, right? As we just kind of said earlier. We have one more question. We're coming up on time, and I just thank you all for
Oh,
hanging
I
with us.
think Dan has his hand
Oh,
raised.
Dan, you want to?
I just wanted to say that, for many, many years, you know, doctor, people who are dying would have these hallucinatory experiences, and it would, they'd see, they were like in a bardo state, and they would see dead relatives or other, people in their lineages, and the families wouldn't know what to do with it. And so the doctors would come in and go, "Oh, it's just a hallucination. Don't worry about it." And it would desacralize the experience. And in the last 10 years, when we've, had the ability to step in and go, "No, no, 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 no. Pay attention. You're the bardo is opening up to you. You can just appreciate the wonder of this sacred experience." And then it changes, because when the person who's dying is, the message is given that it's not real. It's confusing and it's disturbing, and the family is upset. When these experiences are honored as sacred, the person who's dying feels honored, and the family experiences the sacredness of the death. So please don't let doctors desacralize. I'm not saying it's from any bad intention. It's just how they're trained. But they want answers, and they want to shut off the mystery. Let's not allow this to happen. Let's honor these sacred experiences as people are leaving this plane of existence, and it changes everyone who experiences them.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we have one more question. I also want to make mention, though, before we take the question. Um, so this conversation is going to continue. Dan, David, Norma, another colleague, and I are going to launch a death sangha, and this is precisely the kind of conversations we want to have. So you're all on my list now, and stay tuned because we're going to be announcing that fairly soon. All right, so Dr. Don asks a question. Dr. Don, this is a question that's going to take a whole other webinar. It says here, it appears that the world is suffering from mental health challenges and hardwired towards self-destruction. Explain how can the world of mental health impairments overcome the world's self-destructive impulses? All right, anybody want to take that one?
So, having a practice, of practicing calmness of mind and impermanence and detachment does help with mental health. And so I try to introduce my clients, I'm a therapist, to some simple spiritual practice so that they can start to train their minds. Mental illness is often a looping, a negative looping, and if you can give a person an experience of coming out of that negative looping, psychedelics can do that too, lifting them out of that negative looping so that they can get a glimpse of another reality. Really helps with mental health issues. So that's just the beginning of a simple comment, but I hope we could have another whole webinar on that question.
I just want to add that it's not exactly the mental health, but we have, so many of us deal with loved ones who are suffering from dementia. And something my wife and teacher Zoe Goldblatt has taught me as an end of life doula that, when you approach people who are suffering from dementia as if they are in an altered state of consciousness, which they are, then you don't, you're not freaked out by, oh, they don't recognize me, therefore they're not connected to me. If we approach them with reverence and love and say, and find and just respect that they're in an altered state of consciousness, it can change the way we love them out or are with them in this state that we often are afraid of and don't recognize, and so we shut down, and that's tragic. Doesn't have to be that way. And there are teachers like Zoe who are modeling how to meet people in this altered state of consciousness without our expectations of them being in their other state, the state of consciousness we all recognize. But if we approach them with this reverence, amazing things can happen.
I would add, reach out. I'm sorry, can I
Go
chime
ahead.
in? Um, as we reach out to each other with love, with caring, we create such a profound difference in the world. I find myself texting patients I haven't talked to in a few months, friends, and just, hey, how are things? Hey, I heard your mother was sick. And all of a sudden people feel included and cared for. It's a very, if you, this is going to be a whole other webinar at some point, maybe, but we think of form and not form. Suppose you're a complete materialist. That means that form breaks down to what? Molecules, atoms, subatomic particles. We still think of those particles as things. How do you define a particle? It's in relationship to how it interacts with other particles. Ultimately, it is all relationship. There is no there is no thing there. There's no thingness to what we think of as form. We think of going from form to ecstatic dance. Guess what? Form is ecstatic dance from the top to the bottom. And it's certainly, realizing that over time has helped change what I think. I'm, looking at a laptop sitting on a table. They all look like structures to me, but I'm kidding myself. They're all dancing. And I think this is what Voltaire meant when he said, God is just a comedian playing to an audience too scared to laugh. It's okay to laugh no matter what's happening in the world. We're all in this together.
That's wonderful.
Mm.
Any other last thoughts before we close? Well, I have to say thank you all. Thank you, David, for your flexibility in coming on and sharing your stories. Yes, and so we will continue. We love doing these conversations and look forward to seeing all of you again in the future. And again, thank you to our panelists. I love you
Thank
guys.
you. And thank you, Chris,
Thank you,
for
Chris.
all your work in making this possible. You're doing such valuable, meaningful work, and we honor that.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yay,
All
Chris.
right. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
We got some. I'm gonna look at the Q&As real quick. Hey, good job, David. Turn the recording off here.